He was returning home along the street of a small Czech town where he had been living for several years. He was reconciled to his not-too-exciting life, his backbiting neighbours, and the monotonous rowdiness which surrounded him at work, and he was walking so totally without seeing, as one walks along a path traversed 100 times, that he almost passed her by. But she had already recognized him from a distance, and coming towards him she gave him that gentle smile of hers. Only at the last moment, when they had almost passed each other, that smile rang a bell in his memory and snapped him out of his drowsy state. "I wouldn't have recognized you," he apologized, but it was a stupid apology, because it brought them precipitately to a painful subject, about which it would have been advisable to keep silent. They had not seen each other for 15 years, and during this time they had both aged. "Have I changed so much?" she asked, and he replied that she hadn't. And even if this was a lie, it wasn't an out-and-out lie, because that gentle smile, expressing demurely and restrainedly a capacity for some sort of eternal enthusiasm, emerged from the distance of so many years quite unchanged, and it confused him. It evoked for him so distinctly the former appearance of this woman that he had to make a definite effort to disregard it and to see her as she was now. She was almost an old woman. He asked her where she was going and what was on her agenda, and she replied that she had nothing else to do but wait for the train which would take her back to Prague that evening. He evinced pleasure at their unexpected meeting, and because they agreed, with good reason, that the 2 local cafes were overcrowded and dirty, he invited her to his bachelor apartment, which wasn't very far away. He had both coffee and tea there, and, more importantly, it was clean and peaceful. Right from the start, it had been a bad day. 25 years ago, she had lived here with her husband for a short time as a new bride. Then they had moved to Prague, where he had died 10 years back. He was buried, thanks to an eccentric wish in his last will and testament, in the local cemetery. At that time she had paid in advance for a 10-year lease on the grave, but a few days before she had become afraid that the time limit had expired and that she had forgotten to renew the lease. Her first impulse had been to write to the cemetery administration, but then she had realized how futile it was to correspond with the authorities, and she had come out here. She knew the path to her husband's grave from memory, and yet today she felt all at once as if she were in this cemetery for the first time. She couldn't find the grave, and it seemed to her that she had gone astray. It took her a while to understand. There, where the grey sandstone monument with the name of her husband in gold lettering used to be, precisely on that spot, she confidently recognized the 2 neighbouring graves. Now stood a black marble headstone with a quite different name in gilt. Upset, she went to the cemetery administration. There they told her that upon expiration of the leases, the graves were cancelled. She reproached them for not having advised her that she should renew the lease, and they replied that there was little room in the cemetery, and that the old dead ought make room for the young dead. This exasperated her, and she told them, holding back her tears, that they knew absolutely nothing of humaneness or respect for man, but she soon understood that the conversation was useless. Just as she could not have prevented her husband's death, so also she was defenseless against his second death, this death of an old dead man, which no longer permitted him to even exist as an old dead man. She went off into town, and anxiety quickly began to get mixed in with her sorrow. She tried to imagine how she would explain to her son the disappearance of his father's grave, and how she would justify her neglect. At last, fatigue overtook her. She didn't know how to pass the long hours until the time for the departure of her train. She no longer knew anyone here, and nothing encouraged her to take even a sentimental stroll, because over the years the town had changed too much. and the once familiar places looked quite strange to her now. That is why she gratefully accepted the invitation of the half-forgotten old acquaintance whom she had met completely by chance. She could wash her hands in his bathroom and then sit in his soft armchair. Her legs ached. Look around his room and listen to the boiling water bubbling away behind the screen which separated the kitchen nook from the room. Not long ago he had turned 35, and exactly at that time he had noticed that the hair on top of his head was thinning very visibly. The bald spot still wasn't there yet, but its appearance was quite conceivable. The scalp was showing beneath the hair, and, more importantly, it was certain to appear, and in the not-too-distant future. Certainly it was ridiculous to make thinning hair a matter of life or death, but he realized that baldness would change his face, and that his hitherto youthful appearance, undeniably his best, was on its way out. And now these considerations made him think about how the balance sheet of this person with hair, who was just about to take his leave, actually stood, what he had actually experienced and enjoyed. What astounded him was the knowledge that he had experienced rather little. When he thought about this, he felt embarrassed. Yes, he was ashamed, because to live here on earth so long and to experience so little, that was ignominious. What did he actually mean when he said to himself that he had not experienced much? Did he mean by this travel, work, public service, sport, women? Of course, he meant all of these things, yet, above all, women. Because if his life was deficient in other spheres, this certainly upset him, but he didn't have to lay the blame for it on himself. Anyhow, not for work that was uninteresting and without prospects. Not for curtailing his travels because he didn't have money or reliable party references. Finally, not even for the fact that when he was 20 he had injured his knee and had to give up sports, which he had enjoyed. On the other hand, the realm of women was for him a sphere of relative freedom, and that being so, he couldn't make any excuses about it. Here he could have demonstrated his wealth. Women became for him the one legitimate criterion of life's density. But as ill luck would have it, things had gone somewhat badly for him with women. Until he was 25, and though he was a good-looking guy, shyness would tie him up in knots. Then he fell in love, got married, and after 7 years had persuaded himself that it was possible to find infinite erotic possibilities in one woman. Then he got divorced, and the one-woman apologetics and the illusion of infinity melted away, and in its place came an agreeable taste for and boldness in the pursuit of women, a pursuit of their varied finiteness. Unfortunately, his bad financial situation frustrated his newfound desires. He had to pay his former wife alimony for their child, whom he was allowed to see once or twice a year. And the conditions of the small town were such that the curiosity of the neighbors was as enormous as the choice of women was scant. And time was already passing very quickly, and all at once he was standing in the bathroom in front of the oval mirror located above the wash basin. In his right hand he held over his head a round mirror, and was transfixed examining the bald spot that had begun to appear. This sight suddenly, without preparation, brought home to him the banal truth that what he had missed couldn't be made good. He found himself in a state of chronic ill humor, and was even assailed by thoughts of suicide. Naturally, and it is necessary to emphasize this in order that we should not see him as a hysterical or stupid person, he appreciated the comic aspect of these thoughts, and he knew that he would never carry them out. He laughed inwardly at his own suicide note. I couldn't put up with my bald spot. Farewell. But it is enough that these thoughts, however platonic they may be, assailed him at all. Let us try to understand. The thoughts made themselves felt within him, perhaps like the overwhelming desire to give up the race makes itself felt within a marathon runner, when in the middle of the track he discovers that shamefully, and moreover through his own fault, his own blunders, he is losing. And he is then apt to consider the race lost and doesn't feel like running any farther. And now he bent down over the small table and placed 1 cup of coffee on it in front of the couch, where he later sat down, the other in front of his armchair, in which his visitor was sitting. He said to himself that there was a curious malice in the fact that he had met this woman, with whom he had once been head over heels in love, and whom in those days he had let escape, through his own fault, his own blunders. Precisely when he found himself in this state of mind, and at a time when it was no longer possible to rectify anything. You would hardly have guessed that she appeared to him as that woman who had escaped him. Still, she was aware all the time of the night they had spent together. He remembered how he had looked then. He was 20, didn't know how to dress. He used to blush, and his boyishness amused her. And she remembered herself. He had been 35, and a certain desire for beauty drove her into the arms of other men, but at the same time drove her away from them. She always imagined that her life should have resembled a beautiful ball, and she feared that her unfaithfulness to her husband might turn into an ugly habit. Yes, she had decreed beauty for herself, as people decree moral injunctions for themselves. If she had noticed any ugliness in her own life, she would perhaps have fallen into despair. And because she was now aware that after 15 years she must seem old to her host, with all the ugliness that brings with it, she wanted to quickly unfold an imaginary fan in front of her own face, and to this end she deluged him with hasty questions. She asked him how he had come to this town. She asked him about his job. She complimented him on the coziness of his bachelor apartment and praised the view from the window over the rooftops of the town. She said that it was in no way a special view, but that there was a certain airiness and freedom about it. He named the painters of several framed reproductions of impressionist pictures. This was not difficult. In the apartments of poor Czech intellectuals you will unfailingly find these cheap prints. Then she got up from the table with her unfinished cup of coffee in her hand and bent over a small writing desk upon which there were a few photographs in a stand. It didn't escape her that among them was no photo of a young woman, and she asked whether the face of the old woman in one of them belonged to his mother. He confirmed this. Then he asked her what she had meant when she told him earlier she had come here to settle some affairs. She really dreaded speaking about the cemetery. Here on the 5th floor she not only felt high above the roofs, but also pleasantly high above her own life. When he insisted, though, she finally confessed, but very briefly, because the immodesty of hasty frankness had always been foreign to her, that she had lived here many years before, that her husband was buried here. He was silent about the cancellation of the grave, and that she and her son had been coming here for the last 10 years without a veil on All Souls' Day. Every year. This statement saddened him, and once again he thought that a spiteful trick was being played on him. Oh, if only he had met her 6 years ago when he had moved here, perhaps it would have been possible to save everything. He wouldn't have been so marked by her age. Her appearance wouldn't have been so different from the image he had of the woman he had loved 15 years before. It would have been within his power to surmount the difference and perceive both images, the past and the present, as one. But now they stood hopelessly far apart. She drank her coffee and talked. He tried hard to determine precisely the intent of the transformation by means of which she was eluding him for the second time. Her face was wrinkled. In vain did the layer of powder try to deny this. Her neck was withered. In vain did the high collar try to hide this. Her cheeks sagged. Her hair, but it was almost beautiful, had grown grey. However, her hands drew his attention most of all. Unfortunately, it was not possible to touch them up with powder or paint. Blue bunches of veins stood out on them, so that all at once they were the hands of a man. In him, pity was mixed with anger, and he felt like drowning their too long put-off meeting in alcohol. He asked her if she fancied some cognac. He had opened a bottle in the cabinet behind the screen. She replied that she didn't, and he remembered that even years before she had drank almost not at all, perhaps so that alcohol wouldn't make her behave contrary to the demands of good taste and decorum. And when he saw the delicate movement of her hand with which she refused the offer of cognac, he realized that this charm, this magic, this grace which had enraptured him, was still the same in her, though hidden beneath the mask of old age, and was in itself still attractive, though doubly cut off from him. When it crossed his mind that she was cut off by old age, he felt immense pity for her, and this pity brought her nearer to him, this woman who had once been so dazzling, before whom he used to be tongue-tied. And he wanted to have a long conversation with her, and to talk the way a man would talk with his girlfriend when he really felt down. He started to talk, and it did indeed turn into a long talk, and eventually he got to the pessimistic thoughts which had visited him as of late. Naturally, he was silent about the bald spot that was beginning to appear. It was just like her silence about the cancelled grave. On the other hand, the vision of the bald spot was transubstantiated into quasi-philosophical maxims to the effect that time passes more quickly than man is able to live, and that life is terrible because everything in it is necessarily doomed to extinction. He voiced these and similar maxims, to which he awaited a sympathetic response, but he didn't get it. "I don't like that kind of talk," she said almost vehemently. "All that you've been saying is awfully superficial." She didn't like conversations about growing old or dying because they contained images of physical ugliness, which went against the grain with her. Several times, almost in a fluster, she repeated to her host that his opinion was superficial. "After all," she said, "man is more than just a body which wastes away. A man's work is substantial, and that is what he leaves behind for others." Her advocacy of this opinion wasn't new. It had first come to her aid when, 25 years earlier, she had fallen in love with her former husband, who was 19 years older than she. She had never ceased to respect him wholeheartedly, in spite of all her infidelities, about which he didn't know or didn't want to know, and she took pains to convince herself that her husband's intellect and importance would fully outweigh the heavier load of his years. "What kind of work, I ask you? What kind of work do we leave behind?" protested her host with a bitter smile. She didn't want to refer to her dead husband, though she firmly believed in the lasting value of everything he had accomplished. He therefore only said that every man accomplishes something, which in itself may be most modest, but that in this, and only in this, is his value. Then she went on to talk about herself, how she worked in a house of culture in a suburb of Prague, how she organized lectures and poetry readings. She spoke, with an excitement that seemed out of proportion to him, about the grateful faces of the public, And straight after that she expatiated upon how beautiful it was to have a son, and to see her own features, her son looked like her, changing into the face of a man. How it was beautiful to give him everything that a mother can give a son, and then fade quietly into the background of his life. It was not by chance that she had begun to talk about her son, because all day her son had been in her thoughts, a reproachful reminder of the morning's failure at the cemetery. It was strange. She had never let any man impose his will on her, but her own son subjugated her, and she didn't know how. The failure at the cemetery had upset her so much today, above all because she felt guilty before him and feared his reproaches. Of course, she had long suspected that her son so jealously watched over the way she honored his father's memory. After all, it was he who insisted every All Souls' Day that they should not fail to visit the cemetery. Not so much out of his love for his dead father, as from a desire to usurp his mother, to assign her to a widow's proper confines. For it was like this, even if he never voiced it, and she tried hard, without success, not to know it. The idea that his mother could still have a sex life disgusted him. Everything in her that remained sexual, at least in the realm of possibility and chance, disgusted him. And because the idea of sex is connected with the idea of youthfulness, he was disgusted by everything that was still youthful in her. He was no longer a child, and his mother's youthfulness, combined with the aggressiveness of her motherly care, disagreeably thwarted his relationship with girls who had begun to interest him. He wanted to have an old mother. Only from such a mother would he tolerate love, and only of such a mother could he be fond. And although at times she realized that in a way he was pushing her toward the grave, she had finally submitted to him, succumbed to his pressure, and even idealized her capitulation, persuading herself that the beauty of her life consisted precisely in quietly fading out in the shadow of another life. In the name of this idealization, without which the wrinkles on her face would after all have made her far more uneasy, she now conducted with such unexpected warmth this dispute with her host. But he suddenly leaned across the little table which stood between them, stroked her hand, and said, "Forgive me for my chatter. You know, I was always an idiot." Their dispute didn't irritate him. On the contrary, his visitor yet again confirmed her identity for him. In her protest against his pessimistic talk, wasn't this above all a protest about ugliness and bad taste? He recognized her as the person he had once known, so her former appearance and their old story filled his thoughts all the more. Now, he wished only that nothing destroy the intimate mood, so favourable to their conversation. For that reason he stroked her hand and called himself an idiot, and he wanted to tell her about the thing that seemed most important to him at this moment, their adventure together. For he was convinced that he had experienced something very special with her, which she didn't suspect, and which he alone could, if he made the effort, put into words. He no longer remembered how they had met. Apparently, she sometimes came in contact with his student friends, but he remembered perfectly the out-of-the-way Prague cafe where they had been alone together for the first time. He had been sitting opposite her in a plush booth, depressed and silent, but at the same time thoroughly elated by her delicate hints that she was favourably disposed towards him. He had tried hard to visualize, without daring to hope for the fulfillment of these fancies, how she would look if he kissed her, undressed her, and made love to her. But he just couldn't bring it off. Yes, there was something odd about it. He had tried 1,000 times to imagine her in bed, but in vain. Her face kept on looking at him with its calm, gentle smile, and he couldn't, even with the most dogged efforts of his imagination, distort it with the grimace of physical ecstasy. He absolutely defied his imagination. And that was the situation, which had never since been repeated in his life. At that time, he had stood face to face with the unimaginable. Obviously, he was experiencing that very short period, a heavenly period, when fancy is not yet satiated by experience, has not become routine, knows little, and knows how to do little, so that the unimaginable still exists, and should the unimaginable become reality, without the mediation of the imaginable, without that narrow bridge of fancies, a man will be seized by panic and vertigo. Such vertigo did actually overtake him when, after several further meetings, in the course of which he hadn't resolved anything, she began to ask him in detail and with meaningful curiosity about his student room in the dormitory, so that she soon forced him to invite her there. He shared the little room in the dorm with another student, who, for a glass of rum, had promised not to return until after midnight. It bore little resemblance to his bachelor apartment of today. 2 metal cots, 2 chairs, a cupboard, a glaring, unshaded light bulb, and frightful disorder. He tidied up the room, and at 7 o'clock, it went with her refinement that she was habitually on time, she knocked on the door. It was September, and only gradually did it begin to get dark. They sat down on the edge of a cot and kissed. Then it got even darker, and he didn't want to turn on the light, because he was glad that he couldn't be seen, and hoped that the darkness would relieve the state of embarrassment in which he would find himself having to undress in front of her. If he knew tolerably well how to unbutton women's blouses, he himself would undress in front of them with bashful haste. This time, however, he didn't for a long time dare to undo her first button. It seemed to him that in the matter of beginning to undress there must exist some tasteful and elegant procedure, which only men who were experts knew, and he was afraid of betraying his ignorance, so that in the end she herself stood up and, asking with a smile, "Shouldn't I take off this armour?" and began to undress. It was dark, however, and he saw only the shadows of her movements. He hastily undressed too, and gained some confidence only when they began, thanks to her patience, to make love. He looked into her face, but in the dusk her expression entirely eluded him, and he couldn't even make out her features. He regretted that it was dark, but it seemed impossible for him to get up and move away from her in that moment to turn on the switch by the door, so vainly he went on, straining his eyes. But he didn't recognize her. It seemed to him that he was making love with someone else, with someone spurious, or even someone else quite unreal and unindividuated. Then she got on top of him. At the time, he only saw a raised shadow, and, moving her hips, she said something in a muffled tone, in a whisper, and it wasn't clear whether she was talking to him or to herself. He couldn't make out the words and asked what she had said. He went on whispering, and even before he clasped her to him again, he couldn't understand what she was saying. She listened to her host and became increasingly absorbed in the details which she had long ago forgotten. For instance, in those days she used to wear a pale blue summer suit, in which, they said, she looked like an inviolable angel. Yes, she recalled that suit. She used to wear a large ivory comb stuck in her hair, which they said gave her a majestically old-fashioned look. At the cafe she always used to order tea with rum, her only alcoholic vice, and all this pleasantly carried her away from the cemetery, away from her sore feet, and away from the reproachful eyes of her son. Look, it flashed across her mind, regardless of what I am like today, if a bit of my youth lives on in this man, I haven't lived in vain. This immediately struck her as a new corroboration of her conviction that the worth of a man lies in his ability to extend beyond himself, to go outside himself, to exist in and for other people. She listened and didn't resist him when, from time to time, he stroked her hand. The stroking merged with the soothing tone of the conversation and had a disarming indefiniteness about it. For whom was it intended? For the woman about whom he was speaking, or for the woman to whom he was speaking? After all, she liked the man who was caressing her. She even said to herself that she liked him better than the youth of 15 years ago, whose boyishness, if she remembered correctly, had been rather a nuisance. When he got to the place in his account where her moving shadow had risen above him and he had vainly endeavoured to understand her whispering, for a moment he fell silent, and she, foolishly, as if he would know these words and would want to remind her of them after so many years like some forgotten mystery, asked softly, "And what did I say then?" "I don't know," he replied. He didn't know. At that time she had eluded not only his fancies but also his perception. She had eluded his sight and hearing. When he had switched on the light in the dormitory room, she was already dressed. Everything about her was again sleek, dazzling, perfect, and he vainly sought a connection between her face in the light and the face which a moment before he had been guessing at in the darkness. They hadn't parted yet, but he was already trying to remember her. He tried to imagine how her unseen face and her unseen body had looked when they'd made love a little while before, but without success. He still defied his imagination. He made up his mind that next time he must make love to her with the light on. Only there wasn't a next time. From that day on, she adroitly and tactfully avoided him. He had failed hopelessly, yet it wasn't clear why. They had certainly made love beautifully, but he also knew how impossible he had been beforehand, and he was ashamed of this. He now felt condemned by her avoidance, and no longer dared to pursue her. "Tell me, why did you avoid me then?" "I beg you," she said in the gentlest of voices. "It's so long ago that I don't know." And when he pressed her further, she protested. "You shouldn't always return to the past. It's enough that we have to devote so much time to it against our will." She said this only to ward off his insistence, and perhaps the last sentence, spoken with a light sigh, referred to her morning visit to the cemetery. But he perceived her statement differently, as an intense and purposeful clarification for him of the fact, this obvious thing, that there were not two women, a past and a present, but only one and the same woman, and that she, who had eluded him 15 years earlier, was here, now, was within reach of his hand. "You're right. The present is more important," he said in a meaningful tone, and looked intently at her face. She was smiling with her mouth half open, and he glimpsed a row of white teeth. At that instant a recollection flashed through his head. That time in the dorm room she had put his fingers into her mouth, bitten them hard until it had hurt. Meanwhile he had been feeling the whole inside of her mouth, and still knew that on one side at the top the back upper teeth were all missing. This had not discouraged him at the time. On the contrary, such a trivial imperfection went with her age, which attracted and excited him. But now, looking into the crack between her teeth and the corner of her mouth, he saw that her teeth were strikingly white, and none were missing, and this made him shudder. Both images got loose again, but he didn't want to admit it. He wanted to reunite them by force and violence, and so said, "Don't you really feel like having some cognac?" When, with a charming smile and a mildly raised eyebrow, she shook her head. He went behind the screen, took out the bottle, put it to his lips, and took a swig. Then it occurred to him that she would be able to detect his secret action from his breath, and so he picked up 2 small glasses and the bottle and carried them into the room. Once more she shook her head. "At least symbolically," he said, and filled both glasses. He clinked her glass. "To speaking about you only in the present tense." He downed his drink. She moistened her lips. He took a seat on the arm of her chair and seized her hand. He hadn't suspected when she went to his bachelor apartment that it would come to this sort of intimacy. And at first she felt dismay, as if it had come before she had been able to prepare herself. That perpetual preparedness, familiar to the mature woman, she had lost long ago. We should perhaps find in this dismay something akin to the dismay of a very young girl who has been kissed for the first time. For if the young girl is not yet, and she was no longer prepared, then this no longer and not yet are mysteriously related, as the peculiarities of old age and childhood are related. Then he moved her from the armchair to the couch, clasped her to him, and stroked her whole body. And in his arms she felt amorphously soft, yes, soft, because her body had long ago lost the sensuality that had once ruled it, that sensuality which had readily endowed her muscles with the rhythm of contractions and with the relaxation and activity of 100 delicate movements. The moment of dismay, however, soon melted away in his embrace. And she, though far removed from the beautiful, mature woman she had once been, now almost immediately rediscovered her former character. She regained a feeling of herself, she regained her knowledge, and once again found the confidence of an erotically adept woman. And because this was a confidence long untasted, she felt it now more intensely than ever before. Her body, which a short while before had been trapped, alarmed, passive, and soft, revived and responded now with its own caresses, and she felt the nicety and expertise of these caresses, and it gratified her. These caresses, the way she put her face to his body, the delicate movements with which her body answered his embrace. She found all this not like something she was merely affecting, something that she knew how to do and which was now performing with cold complacence, but like something essential, of which she was elatedly and enthusiastically a part, as if this were her homeland, the land of beauty, from which she had been exiled and to which now she returned in triumph. Her son was now infinitely far away. When her host had grabbed her, in the corner of her mind she caught sight of the boy warning her of the danger, but then he quickly disappeared. Now there remained only she and the man, who was stroking her and embracing her. But when he placed his lips on her lips and wanted to open her mouth with his tongue, everything was suddenly reversed. She woke up. She firmly clenched her teeth. She imagined the bitter unfamiliarity of the substance which would press against the roof of her mouth, and how her mouth would be full, and she didn't give herself to him. Then she gently pushed him away and said, "No, really, please, I'd rather not." When he kept on insisting, she held him by the wrists of both hands and repeated her refusal. Then she said, and it was hard for her to speak, but she knew she must speak if she wanted him to obey her, that it was too late for them to make love. He reminded him of her age. If they did make love, he would be disgusted with her, and she would feel wretched about this, because what he had told her about the two of them was, for her, immensely beautiful and important. Her body was mortal and wasted, but she now knew that of it there was still remaining something incorporeal, something something like the glow which shines even after a star has burned out. What did it matter that she was growing old if her youth remained preserved, intact, within someone? You've erected a memorial of me within yourself. We cannot allow it to be destroyed. Please understand me. He warded him off. Don't let it happen. No. Don't let it happen. He assured her that she was still beautiful, that in fact nothing had changed, that a human being always remains the same. He knew that he was deceiving her and that she was right. After all, he was well aware of his physical supersensitivity, his increasing fastidiousness about the external defects of a woman's body, which, in recent years, had driven him to ever younger, and therefore, as he bitterly realized, also ever emptier and stupider women. Yes, there was no doubt about it. If he got her to make love, it would end in disgust, and this disgust would then splatter with mud not only the present, but also the image of the beloved woman long ago, an image cherished like a jewel in his memory. He knew all this, but only intellectually, and the intellect meant nothing in the face of this desire, which knew only one thing. The woman whom he had thought of as unattainable and elusive for a whole 15 years was here. At last he could see her in broad daylight. At last he might discern from her body of today what her body had been like then, from her face of today what her face had been like then. At last he might discern her unimaginable love-making, first the movements, and then the orgasm. He put his arms around her shoulders and looked into her eyes. Don't fight me. It's absurd to fight me. But she shook her head, because she knew that it wasn't absurd for her to refuse him. She knew men and their approach to the female body. She was aware that in love even the most passionate idealism will not rid the body's surface of its terrible, basic importance. It is true that she still had a nice figure, which had preserved its original proportions, and especially in her clothes she looked quite youthful. But she also knew that when she undressed she would expose the wrinkles in her neck, the long scar from a stomach operation 10 years prior, and her grey hair. He wasn't ashamed of the grey hair on her head, but that which she had in the centre of her body she wore like a secret badge of dishonour. And just as the consciousness of her present physical appearance, which she had forgotten a short while before, returned to her, so there arose from the street below. Until now, this room had seemed to her safely high above her life, the anxieties of the morning. They were filling the room. They were alighting on the prints behind a glass, on the armchair, on the table, on the empty coffee cup, and her son's face dominated their procession. When she caught sight of it, she blushed and fled somewhere deep inside herself. Foolishly, she had been on the point of wishing to escape from the path he had assigned to her, and which she had trodden up to now with a smile and words of enthusiasm. She had been on the point of wishing, at least for a moment, to escape, and now she must obediently return and admit that it was the only path suitable for her. Her son's face was so derisive that, in shame, she felt herself growing smaller and smaller before him, until, humiliated, she turned into the mere scar on her stomach. Her host held her by the shoulders, and once again repeated, "It's absurd for you to fight me." And she shook her head, but quite mechanically, because what she was seeing was not her host, but her own youthful features in the face of her son enemy, whom she hated more the smaller and more humiliated she felt. She heard him reproaching her about the cancelled grave, and now, from the chaos of her memory, illogically there leaped out a sentence which he had enragedly threw into his face. The old dead must make room for the young dead, my boy. He didn't have the slightest doubt that this would actually end in disgust. After all, he couldn't even give her a look, a searching and penetrating look, without feeling a certain disgust. But the curious thing was that it didn't make any difference to him. The very opposite. It excited him and goaded him on as if he were wishing for this disgust. The desire to read, finally, from her body what he had for so long not been permitted to know, was mixed with the desire to debase this reading immediately. Where did this come from? Whether he realized it or not, a unique opportunity was presenting itself. To him, his visitor stood for everything that he had not had, that had eluded him, that he had overlooked, that by its absence amounted to what was so intolerable to him. His present age, his thinning hair, his dismally meagre balance sheet. And he, whether he realized it or only vaguely suspected it, could now strip all these pleasures that had been denied to him of their significance and colour, for it was precisely their colourfulness that made his life so sadly dull. He could reveal that they were worthless, that they were only appearances doomed to destruction, that they were only dust transforming itself. He could take revenge upon them, demean them. "Don't fight me," he repeated, and made an effort to draw her close. Before her eyes she still saw her son's derisive face, and when now her host drew her to him by force, she said, "Please, leave me alone for a minute," and released herself from his embrace. She didn't want to interrupt what was racing through her head. The old dead must make room for the young dead, and memorials were no good, and her memorial, which this man beside her had honoured for 15 years in his thoughts, was no good, and her husband's memorial was no good. And yes, my boy, all memorials were no good, she said inwardly to her son. And with vengeful delight she watched his contorted face and heard him yell, "You never spoke like this, mother." Of course she knew that she had never spoken like this, but this moment was full of a light, under which everything became quite different. There was no reason why she should give preference to memorials over life. Her own memorial had a single meaning for her, that at this moment she could abuse it for the sake of her disparaged body. The man who was sitting beside her appealed to her. He was young and very likely, almost certainly, he was the last man who would appeal to her and whom, at the same time, she could have. And that alone was important. If he then became disgusted with her and destroyed her memorial in his thoughts, it made no difference, because her memorial was outside her, just as his thoughts and memory were outside her, and everything that was outside her made no difference. "You never spoke like that, mother." She heard her son's cry, but she paid no attention to him. He was smiling. "You're right. Why should I fight you?" she said quietly, and got up. Then she slowly began to unbutton her dress. Evening was still a long way off. This time the room was full of light,